So today on the back porch, I'm going to learn you everything you ever thought you knew about Charles Manson's dad. Both of them. So today let's dive into the documents that will reveal the real truth about Charles Manson's biological father. So our story begins back in Ashland, Kentucky with his mother, Kathleen Maddox. Mission takes us back to Ashland, Kentucky, where the story of his origins begin with his mother, Kathleen Maddox. Our journey leads us through the shadows of the past, exploring the hidden family secrets that lie within the faded news articles and the census records. As we trace the footsteps of Manson's early life, we uncover his childhood homes from the Lytle Park in Cincinnati to boarding house in Kentucky. Each location whispers untold stories, and with every document we examine, we find clues that suggest more complicated narratives, tales of infidelity, check fraud, and even an unsolved murder that cast a long shadow over Manson's lineage. So our first stop is the U.S. Census, specifically looking for the records from 1910s to the 1930s, because that's where we will find Kathleen Maddox was only 12 years old, 3 years before she crossed paths with Colonel Walker Scott, a 20-year-old man living with his family. His role was an assistant to his sister in a dry cleaning store. Hints of his aspirations beyond his modest beginnings, but what secrets linger in the margins of these records is what's interesting. What connections exist between Manson's infamous last name and the hidden lives of those who came before him that gave it to him? Well, with each discovery, we will inch closer to revealing not just who Manson was, but the legacy of the secrets that shaped him. The deeper we dig, the more urgent question then becomes, who really is the father of this notorious figure? When you dig into the paperwork that goes back through the layers of history, it tends to become clear that the truth has become obscured by the decades of deception. Rumors have always swirled around how Kathleen Maddox first met William Manson. Some say it was in Cincinnati, where he met her and he legitimized the name of Charles Manson. Others suggest she was sent to live with her married sister to give birth. But as we sift through the paper trail, we uncover a more complex truth. Our investigation reveals that both Colonel Walker Scott and William Manson were entangled in the narrative of young Charlie's paternity. Strikingly, just a month before she became pregnant, Kathleen celebrated her 15th birthday, a pivotal detail that paints a troubling picture. The paperwork we discover points to Colonel Scott as the biological father, a fact that many tried to keep under wraps for years. Well, what might seem like a twist of fate, it was actually William Manson that took pregnant Kathleen Maddox in. They were then married in Kentucky. However, Kathleen lied about her age, of course, because she was only 15 years old. She had just turned 15 years old, and she was barely old enough to wed, and their marriage occurred only 2 months before Manson's birth. I'm sure you've heard that story before too, where this guy Manson, he met Kathleen while she was in Cincinnati ready to give birth. It's all a bunch of bunk, just like everything else. We keep continuing to find all these things that just are not true. Actually, the Maddox family and the Manson family knew each other for years. They were both from the same place in Kentucky. They were practically neighbors with each other. But what were this William guy's intentions? Was he genuinely a nice guy trying to support her and this child? Or did he have some sort of ulterior motives? Especially given the fact that Kathleen wasn't even 17 years old and seemed to be spiraling out of control. And she wasn't even out of junior high school yet. The situation then escalated even more when Kathleen was involved in a car accident that was posted in the newspaper. Yes, this was with a strange guy and another girl, and they were hitchhiking. And that must have set William over the top then, because he then filed for divorce. So technically, this guy was Charles Manson's first father, be it stepdad or not. But he only could put up with the kid for about 6 months, and maybe his mother even less. And then in this divorce, each revelation pulls us deeper into the mystery, fraught with deception and uncertainty. And who truly held the claim to be Charles Manson's father wasn't quite the mystery that we always thought it was. So as we examine the divorce paperwork filed in family court, the details reveal a deeper, more unsettling truth about this marriage of the young Kathleen Maddox to William Manson. Notably, it was William, not Kathleen, who initiated the divorce, a fact that speaks volumes. His own words in the document expose a secret that weighed heavily on him, and this was the knowledge that that kid, Charles, whom he was trying to raise, was not his biological kid. This realization gnawed at him and affected him both emotionally and spiritually. William Manson's reasons for seeking a divorce paint a troubling picture also. He mentions Kathleen's refusal to take on just normal household duties, claiming the home was always in disarray. She didn't even cook for him. She, in turn, nagged about their living conditions, because they did live with his mother at the time. She always longing for a place that they could truly call their own, while she was always lamenting about his meager income from a job that barely paid the bills. It's clear, in this divorce, neither of them was fulfilled. Kathleen's envision of a domestic life, a place where maybe she could play house, while William seemed to expect a wife who would cook and clean, essentially be a maid. At 25, William was a decade older than Kathleen, just as Charles' biological father would turn out to be. Perhaps he believed she was ready for the responsibilities of marriage, but by 1936, he had reached his breaking point, and he chose to enlist in the army, seeking escape through the war. Manson later reflected on his brief memories with William, recalling, "I remember seeing his boots before he went off to war." This statement, devoid of context, might seem fabricated, yet it underscores the fleeting nature of their relationship. Charles was merely a child when he glimpsed the man who bestowed upon him his very last name. Interesting here that the guy in Manson's family that they called Colonel had nothing to do with the military. His parents named him that. You can find that on the census. His name was Colonel Walker Scott. That was his name, not his rank, and he had nothing to do with the military. And we'll find out later that he was probably named for a few war heroes, but he was no hero. In stark contrast, William Manson, though perhaps less illustrious, was indeed the one who served honorably. He was laid to rest in a military cemetery in San Diego, California, a place where visitors can pay respects to a war hero from West Virginia who inadvertently connected his name to one of history's most infamous figures. So as we dive into this tangled web of relationships, we can't help but question, what was the true nature of these connections? What secrets were hidden in the shadows of their lives? Each document, a memory, draws us closer to understanding the complex legacy that shaped Charles Manson. A legacy entwined with loss, longing, and the relentless search for identity. So now we know from birth records, death records, and census records, Colonel Scott was given the name Colonel from birth. Other paperwork shows that when Colonel was 25 years old, Kathleen had just turned 15 years old. 2 months. She had just turned 15 years old, and he got her pregnant while he was married to what would be now his first wife. We know this from a suit that was filed in court. It was called the Bastardly Kid suit. It was filed by Kathleen, filed against Colonel Scott on April the 19th, 1937. And the court sided with Kathleen and awarded her $12 a month in child support. Don't seem like a lot, but today that would equal around $262.33. 14 months after Charlie, the child with Kathleen, was born, Colonel and his first wife had a child of their own. They went on to have one more child before his wife divorced him, citing him as an abusive alcoholic. She won custody of both kids, of course. Colonel remarried, but life continued to spiral downward. In the end, he was buried by his parents and his brother. Colonel Scott died of cirrhosis of the liver at age 44. His grave is next to his mother and his father in Kentucky, alongside the grave of his brother, Darwin Scott. Darwin, interestingly enough, was Manson's uncle, but a lot like his soon-to-be infamous nephew, Charlie. Colonel's father likely named him after famous men in his ancestry who had achieved great things. However, Colonel Scott never lived up to that legacy. He never served in the military, his only action being to fill out the draft card in 1940. Colonel's obituary mentions he worked for the railroad and a custodian at the Elks Club. There's no mention of his connection to Charles Manson, though Manson was indeed Colonel's biological child. Colonel's final residence was a modest apartment in Kentucky, which still stands today. Though he was named after a military hero, in the end, Colonel Scott was an adulterer who tried to hide his child from the world. His greatest accomplishment in life might have been drinking himself to death. So have you heard about Charlie's uncle, Darwin Scott? He's probably the one that Manson takes after most in his entire family. On January 30th, 1970, Ashland, Kentucky Police Chief Lewis Mothers revealed an unsettling theory. Could Manson and his followers have come to Kentucky in 1969 to murder his uncle Darwin? This speculation, mentioned also in Helter Skelter, was dismissed by Bugliosi, who asserted Manson was most likely in California at that time. Yet, the 1930 census reveals that Darwin Scott was behind bars. He was paroled from Atlanta Federal Prison in 1933. His life was a series of headlines, his escapades making him a figure of interest. In 1948, he was arrested for illegal gambling in Kentucky hotels, and by 1953, his wife Faye filed a lawsuit for the substantial losses he incurred, claiming over $90,000, roughly equivalent to $1.3 million today. In 1954, the mystery of Darwin's finances deepened. The FBI began investigating him for writing bad checks across Indiana. Even as he faced fraud charges, he was already in federal custody in Atlanta for car theft. By 1963, he was embroiled in yet another scandal, this time for forgery and check alteration, ultimately sentenced to 10 years at Moundsville Prison in West Virginia. He served 7 years, and then came his untimely death. On May 27, 1969, Darwin Scott, age 64, was discovered gruesomely pinned to his wooden floor in his kitchen, knives buried in his body. Local residents claim to have seen a shadowy figure resembling Charles Manson in the area. Was it truly Manson, or perhaps a rival settling an old score? To this day, Darwin's murder remains unsolved, a haunting mystery. But let us not forget, Darwin's past included check fraud, forgery, and even moonshining. When the authorities did discover his body, they found an astonishing 86 fifths of whiskey and 28 pints in his home. A fitting end to a life steeped in vice and intrigue. Charles Manson often spoke of a rebel spirit coursing through his veins.
Out of the Kentucky mountains, when my uncle said, "We ain't surrendered we're still rebels. And we'll be rebels until the end of time. Because I ain't accepting no Yankee school. He said, don't go to those schools, boy. So when I was 9 years old, I set the school on fire. And I went to
his ancestry reveals a lineage steeped in conflict. His grandfather, Henderson Scott, bequeathed a family history rich with colorful characters. Among them are at least 6 descendants connected to the infamous McCoy family, embroidered in the legendary Hatfield and McCoy feud. Charles Manson's family tree branches out directly through American history, with some fighting the Confederacy and others standing with the Union. Yet, before the Civil War, 6 of Manson's ancestors served in the American Revolution, fighting against Great Britain under the command of George Washington. In examination of Manson's lineage, we uncover a narrative that parallels America's own story. His existence in 1969, often viewed in isolation, fails to capture the full picture. To truly understand Manson, we must look beyond the surface and recognize that his life reflects a broader American identity. Delving deeper, we see that Manson's saga is a mirror reflecting the complexities of a nation, conflict, rebellion, and the struggle for identity. It's a story woven in the fabric of American history, where each thread tells a tale of courage, conflict, and the pursuit of freedom. In this light, Manson is not just a figure in infamy, he embodies a piece of the collective American experience. As we conclude this exploration, we realize that understanding Manson requires us to confront our own history. It urges us to reflect on the darker corners of our past and recognize that within every rebel lies a story that echoes through the ages. A story that is, in many ways, America itself. So traveling through the paperwork of time, we all know more about Charles Manson's dad now. Both of them. And if you want to learn more about Charles Manson's mom and what happened later on in Charles Manson's life, there's a video about it right here. It goes a little bit further into Charles Manson's mom. And until next time, again, as always, thanks for watching, thanks for commenting, and peace.